Well, let's begin at the beginning, and I think the viewers of this will want to know first about your own background. So, what year were you born?
I was born in 1920 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
On what day?
February 3rd, 1920.
1920.
Yes.
Okay. And what are your 1920? That was sort of before modern physics, quantum physics was invented as such.
Well, it was already ongoing. Niels Bohr and Schrödinger and some others in Europe
Right.
had already pretty much proposed the structure of the atom and had started understanding fairly well the basis of modern quantum mechanics.
So you were born just virtually at the same time as quantum physics was being invented.
A little bit later than the first
Right.
successful attempts. Yes.
So
I had nothing to do with it, though.
Right,
of course.
So what are your earliest childhood memories growing up in Philadelphia? Or?
No. My family moved a lot. My dad had no education and no specific training or profession of any sort, and we moved a lot from job to job. And there were some good years and some bad years, but we moved around from one small town to another. And he liked small towns rather than the city, even though he grew up in, or maybe because he grew up in the city. And so...
What was his profession or job?
He had no specific profession or job, and that was part of the problem. He worked as a telephone lineman for a while, climbing telephones and doing the wiring for early telephone connections. He inherited some money from an uncle and went into the construction business and lost it all. And then he managed to acquire a grocery store as the sort of owner and manager. And then he moved from one type of store to another, and eventually owned a drugstore, but without a pharmacy.
And where was that? What city, town?
Well, that was in a little suburb of Philadelphia called Southampton, a little town called Southampton. And then we moved to Berlin, Maryland, down near the shore, near Ocean City, Maryland, near the shore. And I was just 13 when we moved there. And basically I say that's where I grew up. Berlin, because I was in 6th grade, I guess, when we moved there, 6th or 7th. And then I went on, finished high school there, and went on to college from there.
And were you even in high school interested in science or physics? Or?
I was interested in science even before I was in high school, evidently. And I don't know if it was science as such, but sort of technology and gadgets and devices and things like that. And well, for instance, in my senior year in high school, I took my first physics course, and the physics teacher had 1 year of physics in college, which was probably typical in those days, and maybe even these days. But I remember on my final grade in the course, he gave me A++.
Wow.
And the principal, there was another ramification with my grades and things, but the principal with whom I was really quite friendly. It was a small town, small school, and he asked me, Bob, what do you think this means, this A++? He said, I don't know how to interpret that. And so I said, well, why don't you go ask Mr. Brule? He was the physics teacher. I said, why don't you go ask him what he meant? I don't know what it means either. And apparently, Mr. Brule, the physics teacher, told the principal, well, Bob knows more physics than I do, and I couldn't figure out anything else to give him. So,
wow.
And then I went on and took physics in college.
So where did you go to college?
I went to a small college on the eastern shore of Maryland called Washington College.
Right, okay.
And I don't know if you know of it.
Yeah, I do know of it.
Excuse me.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a good, small,
Yes.
liberal arts college, yeah?
Yes. Yeah.
So were you the first member of your family to go to college?
My mother had gone to a secretarial school after high school, and she had been a secretary for a few years before she was married. But I was the first who went to a full 4-year college.
And did you have a scholarship, or how did you pay for it?
Well, when I started out, I did not have a scholarship, but the college scrounged around to give me all kinds of sort of benefits, like there was a book scholarship, for instance. So my books were all free.
Oh.
All my textbooks were free, and I had a campus job as basically the janitor in the library, and I had a couple of sort of campus concessions. There was a candy concession in the men's dormitory,
Okay.
and I was given that concession. And there were a couple of concessions with local cleaners and dryers companies, so that when men in the dorms needed a suit pressed or cleaned or needed laundry done, I was the agent.
So you worked your way through college?
I basically worked through the first 2 years, but then I got a scholarship from the county. Worcester County, and it was administered by Worcester County, but it was called a senatorial scholarship. But and that paid pretty much all my expenses my last 2 years.
So you must have gone to college and gone to Washington College in about 1938?
Yes.
38.
30.
And then you graduated in 42?
Yes.
And your major was in physics?
Is physics, yes. Yeah. So my major was physics, and I had kind of a dual minor in mathematics and chemistry.
So you were in college on Pearl Harbor Day?
Yes. Yeah.
And I presume you must remember that day vividly.
I remember that day in particular because it was my dad's birthday, and excuse me, I had gone home to celebrate his birthday, and so we didn't have the radio on, and that was long before days of television.
Right.
But I didn't know about the Pearl Harbor attack until that evening when I went back to college after being home on over the weekend, and people were running around madly in the dormitories trying to figure out what to do, and several of my classmates sort of volunteered, sort of decided we need to get after those Japs, and so some of them volunteered right out of college.
But you were very close to graduating yourself.
I was close to graduating, so I had to register for the draft, and in principle I was eligible to be drafted, but the draft boards often deferred students who were close to finishing their collegiate career or whatever, and the living in a small town area in Maryland, the head of our local draft board there was a personal friend, so
Yeah.
so
Well, it only made common sense to let you finish. And so you graduated in June and
I graduated at the end of May,
end of May.
in 1942.
And did you immediately have a job, or what
No,
happened next?
I had been promised a teaching assistantship at Indiana University in Indiana to go on to graduate school in physics. My physics professor in college had recommended that. He had gotten his PhD there, and I had applied and been accepted. But when I went home after graduation from college, I talked to the chairman of the draft board, a person, as I mentioned, a personal friend, and I asked him if they would defer me to go to graduate school the following fall.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "No way.
No way.
We're about to send you your greetings letter," and so I sent a telegram in those days, people didn't often make long distance calls, and I sent a telegram to the chairman of the physics department in Indiana, telling him, "I'm sorry, my draft board isn't going to let me come to your institution in the fall. So if all goes well, I'll see you after the war." And I got a note back from him, a telegram back from him, almost immediately, saying, "I can offer you a job in a metallurgical laboratory at the University of Chicago, which would provide deferment from military service." And I wrote back to him again saying, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'm interested in physics, not metallurgy." And I, of course, knew nothing of the metallurgical laboratory at that time. And then within about a day, evidently physics majors who had just graduated, their names were put on some kind of a national register as being possibly available for scientific work or physics-related work.
Right.
And I got a telegram from Purdue University in Indiana offering me a job there as an instructor of Navy enlisted men. Purdue had, well, most of the big universities had educational programs for various contingencies of the military services, and Purdue had one for teaching electricity and electrical wiring to enlisted men in the Navy who, when they graduated from our program, would go directly on shipboard somewhere. And
so you went to Purdue and you took that job?
I took that job at Purdue, yes.
And that provided a deferment from...
That
provided a deferment.
Yes, that provided a deferment. And there was a cyclotron at Purdue, and one of the physics graduate students that I met almost immediately when I went to Purdue was working part-time as a volunteer at the cyclotron facility. Now the cyclotron is a big elaborate machine that's used for nuclear physics research.
Yes.
And so I asked this graduate student if he'd take me and at least show me the cyclotron. I had heard of them, but had never seen one. And so he took me there, and the professor in charge of the cyclotron talked to me and showed me around, and then somehow or other the subject came up of my working there a little bit too, even though I had this full-time job teaching, and I was also going to take an occasional course in the physics department or math department. And so I said, oh, sure, I'd like to come spend a few hours a week helping out down here. And so that's what I did. So it was just unpaid, just volunteer work, just to help out, learn a little bit more about physics. And within a couple of months, the professor told me that they were going to take on a classified project for the federal government, and that I wouldn't any longer be allowed to come in. That it was going to be a secret facility. They were going to have a guard on the door, and I would no longer be allowed in. And I said, well, you people are still going to need the kind of help that this other graduate student and I had been providing. And I said, why can't you get it set up so we can keep working with you? And I remember he looked at me and he said, I never thought of that. And then a couple of days later, he called me aside and he said, Bob, if you want, we can hire you into this classified project. We'll get you security clearance, and we'll hire you, and you'll get paid a little bit this time for doing the same thing you've been doing as a volunteer. And so this other graduate student and I signed on, and then it was a one-year contract with the federal government using the cyclotron for some classified nuclear physics research that was related to problems of the Manhattan Project. Mm-hmm. So it was before the Manhattan Project, before Los Alamos, for instance, was in operation, and it was still 1942. It was the summer of 1942, about 2 months after I had graduated from college, and so we worked on that, and then.
So at that point, you hadn't even heard the phrase Manhattan Project?
No.
Okay.
And I had no idea about,
right.
Well, I learned about nuclear fission, but I hadn't learned anything about chain reactions, as I recall, but just the basic interactions that the nuclei do, not the
right.
whole thing that goes on in a chain reaction system.
So how long did this job at Purdue last?
It was a one-year contract that they had, and two additional faculty type people, research people, came from Cornell University to work at Purdue. So there were two Purdue faculty people and two who came from Cornell, who were the leaders of the program and the research scientists, basically. And then there was this other graduate student and I working around and doing odds and ends and with them on the project. It was a one-year contract. And then towards the end of that year, in the fall of 1943, one or another of the faculty men told me, we're going to be leaving. All four of us are going on to a project out west, and we can't tell you where it is, we can't tell you what it's about, but you and Harry, the other graduate student, are suddenly going to be in charge of the cyclotron. And it was a major research facility at the university in the physics department at that time. And he said, so you and Harry are going to be in charge of the cyclotron. And you guys are going to have to figure out what to do with it.
This is Harry. What was Harry's last name?
Harry was Dallian. Harry Dallian. And if you know, he was the first person who was killed in a radiation accident at Los Alamos.
Really?
So he was my personal friend there at Purdue. And but anyway, so very suddenly these 4 faculty type people disappeared, and Harry and I were left in charge of the cyclotron, and there was no longer a classified facility. The guards went away, the doors were open, it was just an open research facility. But within a couple of weeks or so, 2 of the man who had come, one of the men who had come from Cornell, and the man from Purdue, who was in charge of the facility there, both wrote to me from Los Alamos. It turns out that's where they had gone. And they both wrote to me separately and said, hey Bob, we think you ought to come out here. This would be a great place. You can make good contributions, and we think you'd really enjoy it. And so I talked to my friend Harry, and they didn't invite him, they just sort of invited me. But I talked to Harry, and he said, gee, I'd like to go too. See if they'll let me come too. And so we didn't know where it was.
Right.
We didn't know what it was about. And so I wrote back and said, Harry would like to come too. And the one man who had been at Purdue in charge at the whole time said, okay, if he really wants to come. He said, we're at high altitude here, and Harry had some medical problems, and it might not be appropriate for him to come to this altitude. But, and I talked to Harry, and he said, I don't care, I want to go anyway. And so Harry and I moved to Los Alamos in the fall of 1943. And the 4
Do you remember the month? Was it,
beg pardon?
what month in 43?
It was in December.
December.
By the
43.
time we got all the paperwork straightened out and everything. The contract had gone, the classified contract had gone from October 1st to October 1st, the fiscal year kind of thing. And
so you arrived in Los Alamos in December of 43. Yes. by train? By train,
yes. Yeah. We went on the Chief or Super Chief or whatever the big Santa Fe train was at that time, and went on the train from Chicago.
And then did you check in Santa Fe in the famous little Los Alamos office?
Yes, a WAC, a Women's Army Corps woman in the Army at Los Alamos was what drove. We got off the train in Lamy, New Mexico, which is a little stop somewhat near Santa Fe, and this WAC woman met us there, and she was a driver, so she drove us into the 109 East Palace, Santa Fe, to the that front office, and we checked in there, and then she took us on up to Los Alamos that afternoon. And we checked in. We were both unmarried, and moved into a dormitory in Los Alamos, and then started to work.
So you spent the rest of the war in Los Alamos.
Yes.
And what was your first impression of this secret city? Los Alamos.
Well, the city itself was not much of a city yet at that time, but you know, it would. I guess it was just fun to be in a new situation, and then and immediately the four staff people who were there were part of the group. They were the major part of a group with which I was going to work, and there was the group leader was a professor from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and he had been an office mate in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin with the lead Purdue faculty man who had been in charge of the cyclotron. So they were personal friends, and maybe that probably was part of the reason that the team from Purdue joined this other man and set up a group.
And what was his name, the team leader?
His name was Donald Kirst.
Kirst.
K-E-R-S-T.
Okay.
And he incidentally invented what's called the betatron, which is another nuclear physics instrument that. That's a different story.
What was your team specifically working on when you first arrived?
I'm sorry.
What was your team working on when you first arrived?
The project they were working on was to design and build and operate and understand a special nuclear reactor, an operating reactor based on enriched uranium. It was going to be the first device of any sort that was built with enriched uranium, and the uranium was in a liquid solution, a water solution, and was contained in a thin-walled sphere about 1 foot in diameter. And then there was graphite and other things around it as what are called reflectors to help improve the criticality conditions of this reactor. And so the four staff members who had come from Purdue, by the time we got there, Harry and I got there, had already each taken a sort of a partial of the whole project to design equipment, and the designs were in the shops. Some of it was mechanical building of devices. Some of it was electronic control circuitry and circuitry to read out the conditions, the nuclear conditions of the facility when it was operating. And so these four men had all already designed those things, and they were in the shops. And then during the early winter, like January and February, these various components were finished in the shops and delivered to our laboratory. And each time when something would come, the staff member who had designed it asked me to help test it to make sure it met the requirements and the operating conditions were all adequate. And so it turned out that almost by default that I was the only one in the group that really knew all of the systems, including the electronic controls and operings. And so then in the spring, when we were loading the uranium fuel I was the one at the control rods, at the controls at the facility. And the whole project was an idea of Enrico Fermi's.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and Fermi at that time was still at the metallurgical lab in Chicago, but he came out frequently to visit Los Alamos. And
So you would meet with Fermi?
Beg pardon?
You would meet with Fermi?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And I taught him, he was always interested in exactly what was going on, and I taught him basically how to operate the facility, because I at the controls, I did it dozens and dozens of times to verify that everything was working okay and to look at different conditions. And I taught him how to operate it, because he was very curious and wanted to learn. And it was fairly straightforward, but there were certain things you had to do.
You were teaching Fermi.
Yeah. But then when we finally, when the facility was finally expected to go critical, and we were getting enriched uranium in small batches from Oak Ridge. And so it took us about 2 weeks to actually load a little bit of uranium every couple of days or so as it arrived from Oak Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
And we had chemists in our group who had to process the uranium. The way it was shipped from Oak Ridge was not in usable form for our facility. So we had chemists who ran it through various stages to process it. So it took the order of a day or two after they received it and before it was ready for us to use. And then, so it took us a couple of weeks to gradually, every couple of days, add a little bit more uranium and test and verify its conditions. And then we were able to predict pretty well when it was going to actually become a critical self-sustained chain reaction. And there were a lot of the big important members of the Los Alamos lab, not members of our group, but of other groups and management and so forth, who were alerted that, hey, this day it's going to go critical. And it was one of the key steps towards understanding more about.
What day did it go critical?
You know, I don't remember for sure. It was early May, 1944.
44.
By that time, yes. But
was Oppenheimer in attendance that day?
I don't think Oppenheimer was there in the group, but there were a lot of other important people of the lab who were there, and well, Dick Feynman he had done calculations to try to predict what would constitute a critical condition for our facility. And so he was very interested. And so almost day by day, he would also come and check and see how we were doing. So he and I were on a first name close basis. I showed him how to operate too,
Right.
But he wasn't particularly interested in that.
Bob, how soon after you arrived at Los Alamos were you aware of what the gadget, what they were building?
Within 24 hours.
Within 24 hours. So who told you?
The day after we arrived there, we went to work. It was, we arrived late in the afternoon and checked in the dorm and all that kind of stuff. And then the next day we went to work, and the people from Purdue, and we met the group leader who was in charge, of course, and they handed us a bunch of documents and said, "Here, go read these," and then they told us about the project briefly, they verbally told us, and one of the men, I don't remember which one, got up at a chalkboard and kind of drew what we were working on, and explained the concept of a fission bomb to us. And then they gave us these various documents. And
wow. So what was do you recall your initial reaction that you were working on a bomb? Were you shocked or excited or?
Well, I was excited, and at the time there was a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not a fission bomb would actually work. Mm-hmm. And so there were about 3 concepts all intermingled at the same time. One was that fission had been discovered in Germany, and there was a possibility, highly likely, that the Nazis were working on a similar kind of thing, mm-hmm. a bomb type device. And it was important that we find out whether or not such a device would function, would actually explode. So that was, and find it out before the Nazis. So it was important to do that.
So then, were you told the name of Heisenberg? Did you know the name of the German physicist Heisenberg?
I had heard, yes. I had taken an introductory quantum mechanics course at Purdue, mm-hmm. and I had heard Heisenberg and
the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Yes, yeah. So I learned those. I learned Heisenberg and Schrödinger and Niels Bohr and the atom concept and other things.
When did you first encounter Oppie?
Well, there's an amusing story about it. Within a couple of weeks after I arrived at Los Alamos, I wrote to my parents to tell them where I was almost right away, but I couldn't say very much about it. And then I got a letter from my mother after about 2 weeks that asked a bunch of questions. Where are you? What's the name of the city? What are you doing? You know, a typical mother kind of letter. And I got it from the mailroom at the lab, and opened it up, and there were pieces of it cut out.
It censored your mom's letter.
Yes, and I held it up and showed it to one of the staff members who had been at the Purdue project was there in the room. I held it up and I said, "Look what they did to my letter." And he jumped up and he grabbed me by the hand and said, "Come on." And we ran at full speed from our office to Oppenheimer's office, and Oppenheimer had a secretary in a sort of an outer office, and then his personal office was in behind. And this man, the secretary looked up and said, "Can I help you?" And this man, his name was Charlie Baker, but he said, "Yes, we need to see Oppie." And we walked right on in.
Whoa.
And Oppenheimer looked up and said, "What's going on?" And so we showed him the letter, and he grabbed his hat and said, "Come on." And the 3 of us, Oppenheimer in the lead, went to a different building, actually, and an office of a military officer who was in charge of security. and Oppenheimer showed him the letter and said, "Don't you dare ever do this to anybody's letter again." And then he said, "Find the pieces that you cut out of this." And
Whoa.
I think he was a major or maybe a lieutenant colonel. I don't remember the rank, but he was the resident guy in charge of the security in a way, or the censorship.
Right.
And he said, I have no way of finding that. It almost certainly is in some trash basket. But Oppenheimer said, "Our agreement is that you will not censor any incoming mail. If you have concerns about it, you will send a note to the recipient, but you will not ever cut out anything from someone's incoming mail again." And so, but
Wow,
I
that's a pretty dramatic story. So
yeah,
he
but,
didn't.
But
he-
I was not much of a historian in those days, so I didn't keep that letter.
Yeah.
It accumulated with some other mail and stuff.
But they were censoring your outgoing letters occasionally. Yes?
Yeah, well, outgoing mail, we were not allowed to seal it. And it went through the mailroom unsealed, and they looked at it. And if they had concerns with it, they would send it back to us and tell us, "You can't say this.
I see.
Change it somehow or other." So that was the way outgoing mail was handled.
So when Oppenheimer dragged you over to the security men, was he angry?
Yes. Oh yeah, he was furious that they had done this, because evidently his agreement with Groves
Right.
was that this censorship of that type was not to be done to people's mail.
So you're 23, 24 years old, and Oppie grabs you and takes you, and that's quite a performance. You must have been pretty impressed.
I was, let's see, I was 20. No, I guess I wasn't. It was before I was 23. So.
Yeah. Wow.
No, it was.
Well,
No, I was 23. It was
24. Yes.
Yeah, it was either before the end of 43 or early in 44.
Right.
I don't remember.
So that was your first encounter with Oppie.
Yes.
What was the second?
Well, directly with him, I guess I was in meetings where he was a speaker or in charge or moderator or something several times. But I guess the next time I was in direct personal contact with him was in the summer, and a woman graduate student had come to work in our group, and her name was Joan Hinton. You've probably heard that name. She wanted to bring her mother and a sister out to New Mexico for a vacation in the early part of the next summer, 44, and evidently she decided that Oppenheimer had a ranch someplace out there, and that she would ask him if she could use his ranch. She was about my age, actually not quite as old as I, and she worked in the group. She came and joined the group I was in, but she was she didn't hesitate to say what she wanted.
I see.
And,
Wow.
and so evidently she somehow had contacted Oppenheimer and asked him if she could use his ranch to bring her mother and sister for a little vacation. and he agreed. And then I had a motorcycle in those days, and I would take her, this young woman, over to Oppenheimer's ranch, which was the other side of the Sangre de Cristo
About
Mountains.
40 miles away.
Beg pardon?
About 40 miles away?
Well, no, it was a fair amount further than that. It was you went through Santa Fe and then further east around and up on the east side of the Sangre de Cristo
Right.
Mountains, and it was over in that.
Right. I've visited that ranch.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, on horseback.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. Well, yeah, near a little village called Klaus.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Well, so one time, and I went with her, and we cleaned it out. It was just an empty building at the time, and kind of dirty, and we cleaned it out and washed windows and fixed doors, and I don't know, did bunches of repair, and I dammed, there was a little creek beside it, and I dammed up the creek, and there were some pipes there that evidently had been used for water transport sometime before.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I dammed up this little creek to make a pool and connected the pipes together. So I had a little stream of water running out of the pipe right by the house that was, from this
Right.
little stream. And but anyway, at one of the times after we had started doing this, she and I stopped in at Oppenheimer's office to tell him what we were doing to his house. And so that was the kind of the next time I was on a one-on-one
Right.
connection with him.
So did you ever meet Kitty?
Yes, yeah. I met her at some kind of a social function. We didn't talk very much, but we met and said hello and who are you and
Right.
things like that. Yes.
So I'm jumping around here a little bit, but coming back to your graduate student friend, I'm sorry, what was
Harry.
his name? Harry. Tell me about his accident. That must have been a shock.
It was a shock. He was he stayed in the same group I was in until a month or two after we achieved criticality and did various measurements on the conditions of that operating facility. And then another group was set up.
We got 5 minutes left.
Another group was set up, and they dealt with the fission cores of the bombs, of both the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki bombs, and they were the ones who verified that there was the right amount of material in these cores to be used,
Right.
and did other measurements related to those nuclear measurements, and Harry, for reasons that I don't know, decided one evening to do some additional tests on one of these cores. Now they had the ones to be used on Japan had already been sent. I don't think they had been used yet. When Harry was, it was a day or so before or about the same time. And Harry decided to do an additional nuclear measurement, and he wasn't careful enough in the way he handled the material, and he accidentally caused a supercriticality of the thing, and he had it on a table, and he was a low table. He was leaning over it, and this supercriticality occurred, and he told me he saw a flash of light and realized what had happened, and he disassembled there were blocks of reflector material, and he disassembled it, and then went running out of the building so he wouldn't get additional radiation from the residual radioactivity. And this young woman that I mentioned who was working, I was in the office. It was in the evening after dinner, but we often worked 10, 12 hours a day, and I was in an office on the other side of a big shield wall, and I wasn't aware of anything happening. But he ran out of the building, and this young woman that I mentioned, related in the Oppenheimer situation,
Joan Hinton.
Joan Hinton. She was just arriving. Our building was isolated from the main technical area and the town site, so you had to drive to get there. And she had just arrived, and she was getting out of her car in the parking lot, and Harry ran out and said, "I just killed myself. Take me to the hospital."
Wow.
And so they got back in the car, and she took him up to the hospital. And then she came back later and told me. I was still there in the office. I wasn't aware of anything having happened. So she came back and told me what had happened. And then, but I don't think we went to the hospital that night to try to see him, but we did the next day. And he was very seriously irradiated.
And he died how much longer later?
He lived less than a month. I don't remember exactly.
Very sad. So jumping ahead, were you at the Trinity site?
Yes.
In July of
yes.
45?
I went to the Trinity site. Now, do I have another couple minutes to tell about that?
Sure.
This young Joan Hinton and I taught our group leader at that time was Percival King, and he was involved in some measurements to be done at the Trinity site, but Joan Hinton and I weren't. We were involved in interpreting the measurements they were going to make there, but we weren't involved directly in going there and doing the tests. But so we asked First King to tell us what the geometry looked like and where we could go and watch the Trinity test unofficially. And so he drew me a little diagram on the chalkboard and said, "Here's a hill. Go on this side of this hill, and you'll be able to see it." And so Joan and I went on my motorcycle to the Trinity site, and after dark we went across the desert, partially on the motorcycle, partially pushing it, and found this hill and got on there. And it was raining a little bit, which was unusual in that part of the desert, but it was raining a little bit, but we got up on the side of the hill and sat there. And there were a couple of other people there with us, also from the same group. But it was my concern was mostly with my friend Joan Hinton and I. And so we sat on the hillside there, and then the detonation occurred, and it was overwhelming to see it and to experience the shock wave when it came, the sound wave, about a minute after.
So how far away were you from?
We were about 15 miles away. I never did go back and get a very
But you
accurate
actually
estimate.
felt the shock wave?
Oh yeah, it was a very strong shock
Did you
wave.
feel heat?
And we felt heat, yes.
Wow.
Now we had ridden the motorcycle during the day, mid-July. The sun was out, of course, in New Mexico, and so we got some windburn and sunburn on our cheeks. So our cheeks were somewhat sensitized to the heat that did come, but we felt the heat from the detonation.
Were you wearing goggles or when you watched
No.
it?
No, we didn't have goggles.
So this was an unauthorized visit.
We were totally unauthorized. Yes,
Wow.
but and occasionally I've thought back if the MPs or somebody had found us there, we probably would have followed the Rosenbergs or led the Rosenbergs.
Oh,
or something.
that causes me to ask, did you ever meet Klaus Fuchs or any of the other
Yes.
spies?
Yeah, I met Klaus Fuchs one time early in 1944. I asked my group leader to explain something to me about the functioning of a chain reaction and a bomb, and he said, "Bob, I don't understand that either." He said, "Go talk to Klaus Fuchs. He's an expert." And so, being a sort of innocent young guy, I called Klaus Fuchs' number and asked him if I could come over to his office and talk to him. He invited me over, so I went over and went in and asked him my question, and he got up at a chalkboard and gave me a fairly simplistic but adequate answer. So, and as far as I was concerned, he was just a very knowledgeable scientist.
So did you ever meet Ted Hall?
I met Ted Hall. Ted had come from Harvard. He had just finished his bachelor's degree at Harvard, and 2 or 3 other people came at the same time. And one of them was assigned to our group, and he and Ted were friends. And so the man joining our group introduced me to Ted. And we didn't quite pal around, but we associated somewhat socially a little bit. But I never particularly liked Ted. I didn't like his personality, so I didn't pursue that at all.
Now, I remember in the spring of 1945, there was a meeting called with leaflets. People put out leaflets. I think Robert Wilson was involved to discuss the question of how to use the gadget. And Germany was already virtually defeated,
Yes.
and so there was a debate about, well, why are we continuing to work so hard on this? Do you remember attending this meeting?
No, I didn't attend it.
Okay.
No, but I heard about it, and there were some people who left Los Alamos at that time because they felt that the project shouldn't continue, that Germany was defeated, the Nazis didn't have a bomb, and Germany was defeated.
But you didn't feel that way?
No, I felt that it was important to really verify that whether or not a bomb could be made. I was still a little skeptical in the back of my mind as to whether it was going to work or not. And I decided, well, if it works, if it will work, we better discover it. And then if we discover it and it will work, we should publicize it to the rest of the world. And
I think that was Oppenheimer's argument.
And that was basically Oppenheimer's argument, and I guess maybe I derived it partially from him. I don't claim that I initiated that.
So
concept.
were you in Los Alamos on August 6th, 45, when you heard the news about Hiroshima?
Yes, yeah, and incidentally, on that, the people from Los Alamos who were connected with the core itself were people who worked in the same group that Harry Gallion did, and they worked in the same building we did, and they were all friends. In fact, I kind of helped them package up the core that was used on Nagasaki.
Uh-huh.
But, and so we knew approximately when the Hiroshima bomb was going to be dropped, but not exactly. And I remember I wrote to my dad, and I told him, in a day or so, there's going to be some important news about the bomb, about the war, and I would like you to save me a copy. And
of the newspaper.
Yeah, of the newspaper. Yeah, of a copy of the newspaper.
Wow. So you gave your father advance notice?
I gave my father advance notice, yeah. But I didn't know within a day or two of exactly when it was going to be dropped. But
you knew something was happening. Yeah. And as you look back, what are your thoughts about the use of the bomb?
I'm disappointed still that our government decided to bomb a city with primarily civilians and not much of a military objective.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were several of us who hoped that that somehow our government would figure a way of demonstrating to the rest of the world, and in particular Japan, threaten Japan, in fact, with the use, but demonstrate one somewhere so that the world could see that they were functioning bombs.
Right.
But and perhaps threaten Japan, if you don't stop this war, surrender, unconditional surrender, we're going to bomb you. But and if you made the threat, of course, you had to follow up. You would have to follow up.
Right. But they didn't do that.
They didn't do that.
So Bob, we could go on and on.
Yeah.
But I think there's another person waiting to be interviewed, but I know you had something you wanted to show us?
Yeah, what did I do with it? I put it in one of my pockets.
Okay. Is it still there?
Yeah. This is a little piece of the soil from the ground in New Mexico under the tower where the test bomb was set off, and it's embedded in polystyrene plastic, and a small group after the I guess it was probably after the bombing in Japan, a small group made a bunch of these at Los Alamos, and sent pieces just about like this, embedded in the plastic, to the mayors of most large cities in the United States, with a letter that said, this could happen to your city if there's a nuclear war.
Whoa.
So do whatever you can to avoid any future wars that involve nuclear weapons. And it was a simplistic kind of thing in hindsight.
So this is the famous green glass, right?
And this is the so-called green glass.
Right.
Yeah.
Hold it up to the camera near your face, and then people can see it there.
I don't know if you can see it, but it's about 1.5 inches in diameter, and it's a little bit of green glass from melted soil from below the tower in New Mexico, where the first test bomb was set off.